All right. So is everyone good? All right. My time begins now. My partner and I strongly affirm the resolution resolved the United States federal government should significantly lower its tariffs on goods imported from the People's Republic of China. Definitions are all contextual. All of us know what a sanction, all of us know what a tariff is and what the People's Republic of China is. Onto the plan text. First, that the U.S. federal government should remove all of its tariffs on goods imported from the People's Republic of China. Funding it's going to be normal ways and means and time frame as soon as possible. The normative ethical theory standard is just utilitarianism, which means the weighing mechanism is net benefits. Onto advantage one, which is improving the economy. Uniqueness one is that tariffs are hurting the U.S. economy in the scope. The way is that tariffs on Chinese exports to the U.S. have been there since the trade war went on Trump. B is that the diplomat in 2021 corroborates, saying that the Biden administration has done little and made no changes to tariff structures, and has said that they're still examining the phase one trade deal. Thus, the trade war is still active in the status quo. C is that the balance in 21 cites that Trump enacted a 25% tariff on steel imports that went into effect July 6, 2018. That impacted $34 billion worth of Chinese import. And that was the top 10% of tariffs previously leveraged on aluminum. The little lie is that the response from China was that it canceled all import contracts for soybeans, which put the U.S. agriculture sector in a free fall, leading to the U.S. having to spend more money from tax dollars on subsidies to keep the soybean producers afloat. Second is that additionally, Chinese retaliated with tariffs on American chicken producers, which Peterson says that $1 billion were lost in sales. The disappoint is that New York Times in 21 states that what the result of these tariffs was actually a depression in the stock market when they were announced. E is that Brookings 21 finds that the trade war actually costed the U.S. economy $316 billion by the end of 2020. The F is that while more recent research from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and Columbia University found that the U.S. companies lost $1.7 trillion in the price of their stocks as a result on U.S. tariffs imposed on imports from China. Second is that tariffs are leading to China pulling out of U.S. markets. The A subpoint is that China also felt economic pain as a result of the trade war, though apparently not enough to calculate Trump's administrative core demands for major structural reforms. Indeed, as the trade war dragged on, Beijing actually lowered its tariffs on other trading partners and reduced its reliance on U.S. markets. So essentially what we saw is that when we put tariffs on China, essentially instead of actually making any structural reform that tariffs were meant to aim at. Instead, they just lowered tariffs on their other international trading partners and stopped trading with the U.S. As B. Douglas A. Irwin notes in Foreign Affairs, that two comprehensive studies by the International Trade Commission and Congressional Budget Office concluded that these sort of measures were ineffective. The CBO's conclusion was simple, that trade restraints have failed to achieve their primary objective of increasing the international competitiveness of relevant industries. It realized that tariffs aren't even pressuring China into reforming, since the deficit between the U.S. and China favors Chinese manufacturers. This means that tariffs are only hurting the U.S. economy through a decrease in demand from China and a decrease in supply, leading to economic downturn. The links is that one, the AF plan passes and sanctions are reduced on steel and other industrial goods. And this triggers a couple of key internal links in ours. The first internal link is that of perception. The U.S. reducing sanctions shows that the Biden administration is willing to come to the table with China and thus improves diplomatic relations. The change in U.S. perception is key because it makes China more willing to cooperate with the U.S. The way for this is that Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, recently asked President Joe Biden to restart talks with China to remove tariffs and sanctions. Wang pointed out that the United States tariffs have greatly diminished bilateral talks at all levels. The little eye for this is that solving for tariffs means that bilateral talks will allow for us to solve for the different issues in terms of the economics of the trade deficit, as well as the human right abuses that China is committing. This essentially means that the internal link to solving for all of these issues with China is having bilateral talks. And the only way that we can have successful bilateral talks with them is if we start by removing tariffs. The second link is that of the economy. The way is that by removing sanctions on Chinese imports, the U.S. economy can bounce back, since they can use goods that are produced by China, allowing for good production. And a less reliance on higher prices domestically in other countries means that U.S. companies can produce goods at higher profit margins, and thus they can increase their production, meaning that they can hire more people as well as have lower prices for the consumer. The impact of one of jobs. The little is that a September 29th study by Moody Analytics found that the trade war had already cost the U.S. economy in 2019 nearly 300,000 jobs and an estimated 0.3% of real GDP. The second impact is that of the economy. We see that it's already costed the economy $315 billion, and especially during COVID, we're seeing that there's a double down recession being caused by the trade war as well as tariffs. Reducing tariffs would allow us to actually ease us back out of the recession that we're in due to COVID-19. And thus we would say that would probably increase U.S. company profit margins in general, increasing the stock market and increasing the economy as a whole. The second advantage is that of China war. Unique to this one is that U.S.-China tensions are high right now and will lead to war in the status quo. The way is that the U.S. has already imposed 25% of tariffs on the $15 billion worth of Chinese medtech products, specifically AI and semiconductor related. B is that, as mentioned before, before Wang Wei, the Chinese foreign minister, states that essentially because of these U.S. tariffs, bilateral talks are in all-time low. And C is that U.S. and China tensions are high in the status quo. The U.S. recently sanctioned China over alleged human rights violations. The most diplomatic meeting between China and the United States included an exchange of harsh words in which China refused to compromise on the issues regarding national sovereignty, as well as in accusing the U.S. of inciting other countries to attack them. This tips the brink. Second is that China is preparing for a war right now. They've said that because of these economic and political sanctions, they're going to cyber attack the U.S. The lie is that China is developing cyber warfare capabilities in the status quo and are preparing to deploy their capabilities. The lie is that China is revisionist and seeking status of a leader of artificial intelligence in the status quo. They've already taken a lead on numerous cyber norms through legislation in the United States, in the United Nations, and have started the distribution of AI to other countries to expand, but the capabilities to ultimately take over the United States. But the sanctions from the US restrict China and signal to them that the US is trying to infiltrate China's main market, or sorry, not sanctions, tariffs. The second is that a study by the Center of International Studies in 2020 concluded that China has run cyber operations targeting US infrastructure and is aiming to extract relevant intelligence against countries such as the US, Philippines, Hong Kong, and the United States. And three is that Microsoft disclosed that a new major breach of its services linked to hackers in China. A source familiar with the US government's response told Reuters on Friday that more than 20,000 U.S. organizations were compromised to attack. And four is that essentially we see that because Xi Jinping is adamant on increasing its AI capabilities, he'll go through any means of method in order to make sure that the U.S. has no threat or has no power to reduce his capability as well as strengthen the AI field. The links are simple. First, the plan passes, then the U.S. completely removes tariffs on goods imported from China. The first internal link is that it sends a clear signal that the U.S. is willing to cooperate and not run the risk of a cyber war. Is that China said that they're willing to negotiate with the U.S., and this makes the first diplomatic move. The move is big enough for them to bring them back to the table. And third is that the U.S. is removing sanctions on AI, showing that the U.S. is willing to withdraw from the AI market. Is that this means that China no longer sees the U.S. infringing on their market states, and B, that means that they're probably not going to be willing to cyber attack the U.S. as a result to reduce their market share in the AI market. The impacts are simple. First is small business. Cyber war impacts small business. The law is that cyber attacks directly cripple small business. The law is that according to CNBC, 86% of small businesses are directly vulnerable to cyber attacks. And two is that insurance carrier Hiscox reveals that cyber attacks cost small businesses an average of $200,000, and over 60% of them go out of business after being victimized. And B is that small businesses make up a huge chunk of the economy. According to SBA, they create 1.5 million jobs annually, represent 95% of all economies. 54% of U.S. sales and $6 trillion of the U.S. GDP come from small business. Another collapse of small business makes the worst form of economic recession available. The little eyes that, according to CNN, double dip recessions are much worse because they means that the tools to jumpstart the economy are no longer available, even the U.S. with no policy effort. Yeah, strongly urge an opt out.
I just want to make sure. Whenever he said sanctions in the second advantage, it was tariffs. He corrected himself, but I don't know if you guys caught that.
Okay, before I start, can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. All right. So I'm going to start my time now. Okay, just for a roadmap, I'm going to start on the op side of the case, just quickly add some more context to this motion, and then I'll go down the gov case. So first, I just want to provide some context as to what's actually going on in terms of this tariffs, rather. So as of January 2021, tariffs on Chinese exports in the U.S. were at 19.3%, and Chinese tariffs on U.S. exports were at 20.7%, according to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. So just to provide a little bit more context, the trade war, the height of it, is essentially I would say leveling off, just because of the amount of, the tariffs have essentially stabled, and there's not this phenomenon of repeatedly, one-upping each other in terms of increasing tariffs. One trend that this article actually noticed is that they've been leveling off for the last several months in that regard. Just a little bit of more context to that. Okay, we have two contentions on the op side. Our first is that we maintain economic stability, and our second is that we maintain strong geopolitics. Let's start about our first contention on promoting economic stability. But first, I think it's really important that we actually classify the nature of these Chinese goods to begin with. The taxes or the tariffs that are on Chinese goods have raised the prices for even items like baseball hats, luggage, bicycles, TVs, sneakers, and a variety of materials used by American manufacturers. What this means, or the significance of this, is that Chinese goods coming to the US are a vast majority of the time not unique, meaning that companies in the US are generally able to produce them at the same rate, or produce the same quality of things per all of the examples I listed. So I think that's really important to first clarify. So under our first contention on this idea of promoting economic stability, first thing is that we think we maintain local innovation and we actually spur that, and how removing tariffs in that regard is not a guarantee. Just quickly before I get into this, I just want to point out like a general assertion we hear from the government, which is that if we just completely remove tariffs, China is just going to do the exact same thing and reciprocate all of our actions here without actually a link as to why China has a unique incentive. I'll get to that as to more on their case. But first, on to local innovation. Thanks to tariffs, domestic manufacturers that supply things like defense, automobiles, aerospace, and construction have found relief from the massive flood of subsidized exports constantly streaming in from China's many state-owned enterprises. These companies are now making major investments, including expanded operations and a new hiring of workers, particularly in strategically important industries like steels. So all the analysis they give you about, jobs are decreasing, all that, we just contest all of it, because what's actually happened empirically is because of the lack of the competition, because now American consumers are more inclined to purchase, American goods because of the lower price. They're actually encouraged to buy goods from there, which in turn means because of this higher demand going towards American economies, they now have a need to reach out to more people and hire more workers in that well. We think an impact of this is that it allows small businesses to grow and actually prioritizes American business in that regard. Let's also talk about deficit under this. And this was, I think, came up in the Gov speech, but I think it needs a little bit more clarity. So what a trade deficit actually means is how much you import more than you export. It's essentially that ratio. And as of 2015, according to Forbes, the deficit, meaning the amount by which the US buys more products from China, was at $900 billion. A deficit in this connotation is actually negative. How does a tariff do it? How does removing tariffs do anything to solve this? The answer is it doesn't, because when you remove tariffs, you actually make it easier to now buy Chinese goods at a lower price, which increases the deficit of our relationship. We think that it also actually, if anything, decentivizes China from actually coming to the negotiation table, and also results in an American economy that is far more worse off. With that, let's go into our second contention on this idea of maintaining strong geopolitics. Our first subpoint is this idea of Chinese aggression. China has been acting more and more aggressive to gain power and influence abroad. We think that the United States is a strong democracy, and other countries are following this suit in the status quo. We think that it's pretty clear that tariffs as they exist have, to an extent, damage that is happening on both sides, in the sense that both Chinese and US exports are tariffed on respective countries. But here's why removing tariffs doesn't solve the issues. What have we seen prior to the trade war or anything like that? China had tariffs on US imports before the United States ever did anything. They already had that. They were stealing intellectual property from US business. Simply, the matter of fact is that China doesn't show or have empirically demonstrated that they're suddenly just going to, remove all tariffs on US goods, because they actually prioritize their business and actually protect the companies that engage in intellectual property theft in the United States. Our second subpoint is this idea of influence on America. And we think we can reduce Chinese influence on the US, or rather it is preferable on our side of the house, by reducing our reliance on them, essentially offering more autonomy in that regard. Again, China has done no indication that they plan to lower the 20% tariffs on US goods. In fact, use their own logic against them when they tell you about this idea that China's not shown that they want to be interested in engaging in peace talks. That's because China has zero intention in actually lowering these tariffs in the first place. I want to give you 3 impacts as to why reducing tariffs, or why reducing tariffs ties our dependency directly to China and how that's bad for the US. Impact 1 is that via deficits, the US is already in debt to China, and when you lower tariffs, we increase that deficit. The second impact of this is that we increase reliance on their side of the house, because there's a less likelihood for innovation once we lower these tariffs, because now startups don't have the same incentives to start new businesses, right? For example, let's talk about steel. China is a big steel exporter, but now the United States companies don't have, the incentive to start steel. But even when it comes to things like technology, now we see a lack of innovation in that regard. And finally, we think that third, if China decides to make steel very expensive, they can now raise prices, because when we are reliant on one nation for large exports, they now become the controller of the price for that. That's a simple economic principle. When you have one supply, or when you rely on this one person, they're now able to manipulate prices because of the fact that they've driven out American business. Okay, final sub point here is morally just. We think that this idea of not tariffing goods are often coming from unregulated, dangerous workplaces, and we are essentially inadvertently supporting worker mistreatment. Like a couple of quotes that these people are used to describe that they said there: we are ill-treated and work like slaves. We are treated worse than a horse, cow, goat, or pig, or dog. We suffer torturement, beat, and rude remarks, no payment. And finally, just another idea here is intellectual property theft. 1 in 5 corporations say China has stolen their IP address within the last year in the United States. Okay, with that, let's go on to the Gov case. Their first contention about improving the economy. Note that there's just a lot of clash in general in this round in terms of contesting links, and they just essentially throw a bunch of statistics at us. So, okay, first on this idea of soybean farmers being negatively impacted. First of all, I just want to point about the time frame of that particular instance. That was in the peak of the trade war, and we're actually seeing the benefits or to kind of level off now. Also, I think they don't warrant you as to why the benefits, so to speak, that why actually having more jobs or having all these more likelihood for innovation actually outweighs. We think we outweigh on the magnitude here just because soybean farmers were temporarily suffering. We don't think that's enough. They talk about this depression and then the cost of the US economy. Frankly, I had a little bit of trouble hearing everything since it was a little bit spreading, but just the gist of this, we think that the depression argument, first of all, I think it's clear we're not in a depression due to Chinese tariffs. We also think that tariffs, the cost of the US economy, we also tell you how the US economy has benefited. There's just a lot of clashing cards. We think we need more warranting from them. And then they also talk about in their second contention this idea of perception. They talk about cyber attacks as such. But again, if empirically China has not demonstrated they're actually willing to come to the negotiating table, they don't link as to why they're suddenly going to do that now, while they'll stop intellectual property theft. There's a clear flaw in this, in their whole case inherently, that they don't actually explain the link between, removing tariffs, giving China a free go, hurting American business, somehow means China is going to come to the negotiating table. For all these reasons, I'm proud to oppose. Thank you.
Sorry, 1 second. Okay. Cool. So I'm gonna go F in order, top down, and then I'll go Meg in order. If everybody's ready, my time starts now. Start on their first advantage of improving the economy. The only responses here is that warrants are clashing and that they don't actually give you warranting on how they're benefiting and having more jobs for innovation outweighs and how they outweigh on magnitude. But the first argument here is we can't even outweigh in the first speech because we don't know what the negative arguments are going to be. And the second argument here is that $315 billion lost in 2020 alone because of tariffs probably outweighs on magnitude. Their only terminalization of impacts is somehow small businesses are going to grow and there's going to be somehow domestic innovation. But the argument we give you is that there's literally $350 billion lost in 2020 alone. And the second argument is 300,000 jobs were lost in 2019 and 0.3% of the real GDP. This shows that on magnitude, we're clearly outweighing. Then go to the specific uniqueness. They don't respond to any of our warrants. They just say that there's competing warrants and you should always just be preferring the negative. But that's just not true. We tell you that all of Chinese tariffs were reactive, not proactive. We give you the card from Balance in 2021 that says that Trump enacted a 25% tariff on steel imports that went into effect July 6, 2018. And then after that, China canceled all import contracts for soybeans in August and in September. This shows that China was reactive. They did this after the US enacted tariffs, which means that they are willing to come to the table. All of their tariffs are after the US did them, which means that the resolving for US sanctions is then internally to solving for Chinese sanctions on the United States. The second uniqueness point I want to extend here is that the trade war costed the U.S. economy $316 billion, as I said before. But the second argument here is that U.S. companies lost at least $1.7 trillion in price of their stocks because of U.S. tariffs imposed on imports from China. Both of these go uncontested out of the 1 and C. You want to extend both of these. This clearly shows that the tariffs are are really, really bad for the U.S. economy right now. They're destroying U.S. companies. Just proves that removing tariffs are at least going to provide a risk of solving for all of this. The uniqueness is clearly flowing on that direction. They don't contest this. This shows that if the status quo is bad right now, even the try or die for the affirmative shows that you're already going to be voting after. Then Go to the second uniqueness point. We specifically tell you that tariffs on China have done literally nothing. We tell you that China felt some economic pain at the start, but they immediately went to other trading partners and lowered their tariffs there, which reduced their reliance on U.S. markets. This showed that they were enacted no structural reform that the tariffs were meant to impose on China. None of the IPF stuff was solved for, which shows that the status quo is bad right now, and tariffs are just hurting the U.S. economy right now. This shows that removing tariffs will actually be able to solve for the U.S. economy because structural reform isn't being solved for by either side. Go to the links. All of the links are completely uncontested. They don't talk about the perception, or they talk about it in the second advantage. But on the first advantage, this perception link is really, really key because we tell you the specific part which says that Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, right now asked President Biden to restart talks with China to remove tariffs and sanctions. They are the ones who made the first step to come to the table, but Biden refused right now, which is why they literally withdraw and are about to cyber attack us right now. But if Biden removes sanctions and China sees that the U.S. is stepping up and actually doing what China wants them to, which shows that bilateral talks will start on every single level. This goes cold conceded out of the one that you want to extend this. This shows that China is willing to come to the table, and we're going to be able to solve for all of these issues. The impact here is jobs in the economy. We say 300,000 jobs and $1.7 trillion of stocks in the U.S. companies. This shows that this impact is widely outweighing the negative on magnitude. Go to A2. Start on the uniqueness level. The only response they make is that empirically they're not going to negotiate because of IP theft, and that we're not actually explaining the link that China's not going to come to the table. But this clearly isn't true. We tell you that the reason why China is going to cyber attack the United States is because the US has imposed 25% tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese-made tech products, specifically AI and semiconductor related. And because China is a revisionist state, it's a status-seeking state. It wants to be the hegemon in AI. This is the market that they're ahead of. But the US has infiltrated this market through their tariffs, and this shows that China is going to cyber attack them right now. We tell you that China is deploying cyber warfare in the status quo. There's two key words we give you. The first is that the Center of International Studies in 2020 that they're running cyber operations through U.S. infrastructure in U.S., Philippines, Hong Kong, and Hong Kong. And the second word we give you is of Microsoft, where they disclosed a new major breach that affected 20,000 U.S. organizations. This shows that China is cyber attacking right now as a direct result of these tariffs. This goes conceded out of the one that you want to extend. This then go to the link level. We tell you that because of this Wang card that tells you that the Chinese foreign minister wants these tariffs to be gone right now, and now they're taking the first step. Removing these tariffs is going to be the best diplomatic move, and removing sanctions on AI shows China that the U.S. is withdrawing from the AI market. This means that the U.S. is no longer infringing in the China's hegemon market space, and they're not going to cyber attack the United States. The impact to your small businesses, they cold concede this. We tell you that a double-dip recession would be terrible because 86% of small businesses are directly vulnerable right now, and that China's cyber war would literally destroy the United States. On to the next. Start on their first contention of economic stability. Start on the uniqueness. We'll concede that U.S. companies can produce these goods, but the key warning here is that they concede that China is the lead manufacturer, and thus China can pump out goods at cheaper prices. Empirically, we've seen that domestic production leads to higher prices and lower business profit margins because of tariff. But the second response under this is because of tariffs, China has started to cut off rare earth minerals from the United States. China produces 98% of the world's REMs, which means that the U.S. has no other ways to innovate in climate change because the REMs are key to climate change innovation. But this means that these tariffs on these China putting tariffs on these REMs means that the US can't access these REMs anymore, which means that it's way more difficult for them to create cheap climate change goods, which is key to solving for climate change. On to the link level. The first argument here, the first argument here is that China has caused tariffs have caused China to retaliate, so both imports and exports have gone down. They talk about this deficit. Their arguments make no sense. The trade deficit means that the U.S. is more reliant on imported goods on China, and China is less reliant on the U.S. goods. This supercharges our impact because this is why tariffs are bad. They're literally impacting the U.S. even more right now than China. Thus, tariffs hit the U.S. harder than China. But the second argument is that this just makes it more expensive for small businesses to actually start their companies because they have to pay exorbitant prices because of these tariffs, because they can't just immediately start producing all of these goods. And then the third argument is they give no warranty under this on how small businesses have able to create cheaper goods. We tell you that it's become much more expensive for all of these businesses right now because they haven't started domestic innovation. They've just tried to outsource to other countries, which is even more expensive because it takes because the pipelines are not very streamlined. Go to A2. Just pop it, Anish, if you want to.
Yeah, also on their whole aerospace and innovation point, you want to look to the fact that they never quantify the number of jobs that were actually created. So on this
On aerospace, they never quantify the number of jobs. Don't even there's no like terminalized impact there. Go to A2. On the uniqueness level, they say that U.S. is a strong democracy and tariffs on the to an extent are damaging both sides. And they say that removing sanctions doesn't solve because China has tariffs on imports before U.S. tariffs. This isn't true. They've literally put all of the tariffs on soybeans. All of their major tariffs came after U.S. major tariffs. They can see the perception. Like we tell you the Wang card, which is the crux to our link story. We tell you that this card tells you that China is willing to come to the table right now. They want the U.S. to remove all of these sanctions, which means that they will remove their sanctions.
Tariffs, not
sanctions. Tariffs. They want to remove tariffs. This means that we can actually solve back for all of these issues. Then go to their second link of the influence on the United States. They say that they're going to reduce reliance, but they concede the warranty from our case, which is super simple. Wang says the tariffs are the reason why peace talks aren't happening right now, which means that our internal link functions, they don't give you a competing warranty. Therefore, you prefer internal warranty. Go to their impact level. Tariffs make it more expensive for small businesses that want to use steel for something else. No small businesses is trying to make new steel right now. It's a saturated industry. Instead, more small businesses want to use steel, and that's more expensive because of these tariffs, which he said is even harder for small businesses to generate right now. But then on the morality argument, the U.S. outsources for most of their research production. Look to Nike, who employs sweatshops. This happens no matter if we're getting goods from China or from somewhere else. Thus, you're going to be voting affirmative on the risk of solvency.
All right. All right. So sorry. I'm just getting myself organized. Before I begin my speech, can everyone hear me all right? And is everyone ready?
Yeah.
All right. So without just my computer's noisy. I can move it like that.
What's the order?
Sorry.
What's the order of your speech?
Yeah, I was just about to get into that. I personally don't know if off-time roadmaps are allowed, at least in New York Parley, we don't do that. So I'm just going to do it on time. So as long as everyone can hear me, I will begin my time now. Hello, judge and fellow debaters. My name is Arjun Shore, and alongside my partner, Ambika Grover, we are arguing for the neg side of the motion. So just for a little bit of a roadmap, I'm going to start on what I feel like are some important notes for this debate, and then moving down case by case. So just for a few things, first off, to start out, in general, I feel like the flowing has been a little difficult because of, especially in the last speech, a lot of spreading, which has made flowing quite difficult, at least for me personally, and I feel like the flow has been quite messy. So I'm going to try and be a little bit more clear during my speech. And just for some other notes, regarding two key ideas. First of all, the idea that this trade war is still ongoing. We want to recognize that the trade war has ended. If you look towards all of the cards they have provided, they all talk about what happened during the trade war, and they all talk about the trade war in the past tense. We observe that in the status quo, this embargo on soybeans does not still exist. The trade war is over, and any idea that they have is contradictory to the cards and also the present. Second of all, on this idea of China responding, that this was exclusively responsive and that any tariff was just responsive. Now, we want to point out that their card doesn't prove this, right? All their card does is that China responded to one tariff that the U.S. put on, and that in no way is a way to generalize and categorize all of U.S. tariffs. But I also want to observe something from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, which was observing that as of 2018, China was maintaining over twice the tariff rate on the United States. And we observed that this tariff rate of China having higher tariffs, China has always had higher tariffs on the United States. Even during the height of the trade war, they still maintained higher tariffs. And we observed that this idea that like China was responding and that we had the stronger tariffs isn't true. All right, now to move through the case, I'm going to start on the gov side. Now, regarding economics, they talked a lot about how the actual impacts, specifically how $315 billion were lost from the tariffs in 2020 alone, and that it caused a lot of job loss, et cetera, et cetera. And we observed that this did happen. Like, of course, money was lost and tariffs are expensive. That is true. However, there's a couple of reasons why this isn't as important. First of all, we observed that like the job loss that they are talking about actually isn't as significant as it may appear. It was a few 100,000, which we observe is important, but we believe that the innovation actually covers that, and the growth of business covers that. Now, they talk about how $315 billion, that might be something they bring up repeatedly, but we want to observe that $315 billion versus spurring new innovation and more jobs in small businesses and people getting hired is always more important than the stock price of a big corporation or the enormous overall GDP. We observe that the actual impact is more important. I'm going to talk about that a bit going forward. They also talked about retaliation and how China will always retaliate. But again, as my partner said, there's no reason to believe that China will change this. Like, China has always had this policy of having higher tariffs, and China will retaliate, but we observe that it is worse in the gov side of the world, where China has these high tariffs and we do not respond to them in any way. As I said, I want they responded. When we said this, they responded by saying China was willing to come to the table, like a foreign minister said that. But we observe what actually happened in the Peterson Institute of International Economics, which actually shows that in the status quo pre-trade war and pre this tariff war, that China was maintaining this. And so regardless of what China said, we observe that China will put on these high tariffs, and they will remain. Regardless of what China says, these tariffs are going to remain high, which is why you buy our side of retaliation. So to talk about a bit about their impact, they talk about perception and how China will come to the table. We observe that in reality, China hasn't ever really come to the table, regardless of whether the US takes this stance of being more passive and having at one point in time a 3% tariff rate, and still China doesn't come to the table. Second of all, this idea of economy. We observe they talk a lot about how we rely on US goods, and we actually think this benefits the neg side of the motion. We see in the neg side that we rely more on United States production, which spurs innovation, more job creation, and overall better for United States production versus being what's good for Chinese production. All right, now moving on to their second argument regarding war. This idea that a war is unique in any world isn't really true. They made the warranting that Chinese aggression and cyber attacks are only happening because of tariff, yet they bring up the example of Hong Kong. They say that cyber attacks are happening in Hong Kong, yet they also say cyber attacks only happen because of tariffs. We observe this is ridiculous because Hong Kong is not putting tariffs in place on Chinese goods. And so the idea that cyber attacks only occur during tariffs is ridiculous. And still, we observe they talk about how there are currently cyber attacks ongoing from China, and this is post the trade war, and this is after tariffs have been reduced. So there's no way to buy this warranting, as pragmatically is not supported. So we observe that war is non-unique, and the only way that we can combat Chinese aggression is not by bowing down to them and being a doormat, but by actually standing up to China. All right. And the impact is small business. The impact they brought up is small business, but we observe that small businesses are helped a lot more when innovation occurs and when they are allowed to grow in the neg side of the world. All right, now moving into our case on economics, they talk about we argue that these are non-unique goods. Now they made the argument that China is the lead manufacturer, and we agree with this. However, that's not what that's ignoring the key part of this argument, which is that by keeping these tariffs in place, we are spurring innovation and growing the manufacturing within the United States. If we remove these tariffs, China will maintain its position as the lead manufacturer and have the cheapest goods forever. The only way to do this is to spur and help United States manufacturing, which we observe only happens on the gov side of the world. Now, regarding local innovation, this isn't something that they talked about at all. So please carry forward the impact of this, which is we see more innovation, which is more job creation, more small businesses, and more technological advancement, as well as a reduced reliance on China. And thirdly, on the idea of the deficit, they argue that the deficit only occurred in the world where tariffs exist. But we observe that's not how tariffs work. How tariffs works is it reduces the amount we buy on China, inherently decreasing the deficit. So the idea that and we also observe that in a world as of in the past where we had low tariffs, there still was a trade deficit, which in fact was even higher than in the trade war. So we observe that the deficit is decreased and when there are tariffs, meaning that in the gov side of the world, tariffs the deficit rather will go up, hurting businesses and giving China more influence on the United States. All right. Second of all, in terms of geopolitics, we talked about how it's stopping Chinese aggression, and Chinese aggression is reduced by these tariffs. And they made the argument that there's no actual way to see this at all. first of all, like I want to just say this is about generally adopting a standpoint of standing up to China. We're not saying that putting a 10% tariff on steel will immediately create structural reform and make China a democracy. No one's arguing that. But we are arguing that we cannot take the stance of being passive and being a doormat to China. Standing up to China and seeing other democracies around the world standing up to China and taking a more defensive attitude towards China is a move in the positive direction, and over time will see change. Third of all, they talked about how second of all, rather, we talked about influence and how it's giving China no autonomy. There was really no response to this. We are a democracy and we want autonomy from China. So the more autonomy we have, the better for the United States and its democracy. And finally, on the idea of moral autonomy, they said it will happen regardless. We observe this isn't true by spurring innovation in the United States, which has to follow certain labor laws. We see that the growth and innovation happens in a moral way. And for all of these reasons, I strongly, strongly urge a neg ballot. Thank you for your time today.
All right. Just before I start, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to start my time now. I want to start talking about like a general observation we've seen throughout the Gov case, and then I'm going to offer a little bit of analysis on comparatives, the economy, and then this geopolitical argument. So first, I want to talk about what the Gov case like primarily consists of. The vast majority of the argumentation we are hearing from the government talks about how the trade war was bad. We lost jobs, so to speak. But what the key, we think the root that they're missing or the link they're missing is how suddenly removing every single form of the 66% of Chinese goods that are tariffs suddenly is going to solve all the issues they talk about, right? Because they simply, they use like the empirical evidence that exists to somehow assert that their solution is somehow not going to result in that same loss. We think that it's crucial, judges, that you don't just vote off like statistics that have happened empirically, rather actually listen to the warranting that's actually coming out of both sides. Okay, with that said, I want to first talk about comparatives and what Chinese actions are actually going to look like after removing tariffs. As Arshan tells you, just because a Chinese diplomat wants to talk to Biden, that literally does not prove anything in terms of somehow they want to come to the negotiating table. Look how Arshan also provides you extensive analysis that how empirically China is the one who put tariffs on the United States first, how China has been like for a long time been stealing 1 out of every 5 intellectual property things coming from the United States. There's no indication that that's going to clear up, and their whole argument here simply relies on the fact that one Chinese minister wants to talk to Biden and Biden said no. We think that fundamentally doesn't prove anything in that regard. But let's talk about the actual comparatives, because what we've seen on the Gov side is an actual lack of engagement on what their world is actually going to look like. In their world, we remove all sorts of tariffs immediately. This doesn't implicitly entail that we're going to negotiate with China and China is going to reciprocate the exact same things. The only thing the Gov policy is advocating for is a total removal of tariffs, regardless of anything that China is going to do. They're not advocating for, may I remind you, that somehow if China agrees to this, then we'll remove all tariffs. It is absolute. So what that means is that they are, in essence, regardless of what China does, even if China comes out in a week and says that, we're going to, raise tariffs, we're going to raise the roof on this thing, they're still maintaining an absolute policy of removing tariffs, and that is exactly what appeasement exactly is. Don't let them come up here and tell you that because a minister agrees or because China likes the US, it's going to agree. Note that an absolute removal of tariffs does not entail China does anything in that regard. We think that's a huge misconception that loses Gov the round. But our second voter issue, or the second important thing, is to talk about the economy here, right? And also something that they completely drop, and don't let them respond to this later, is the idea of reliance. When you implicitly are removing tariffs, now China becomes this main or primary source of certain goods, right? Because you remove American competition because their prices are now higher relative to Chinese goods which are cheaper. I think we all agree on that. But what that means is that when you tie goods to China, when you buy out American manufacturers who are now not able to actually produce those same goods, you are tying your economy directly to China, which means that if China chooses to raise prices on these things, now the US is uniquely tied to them. They completely drop the 3 pieces of analysis I give you and that Arjun extends in his last speech. The first is the idea of deficit, how deficit is actually going to increase on their side of the house because its absolute removal of tariffs doesn't actually solve anything. The second was this idea on the reliance of innovation. They just throw around numbers that were there before. They don't actually engage with the meat of this argument. And finally, we tell you how we're tying our government to them. Finally, on this idea of the global geopolitical standing, completely drop our arguments about how when you remove Chinese tariffs, you are now supporting goods that are made by Uyghur Muslims or people who are living in poor working conditions. That goes completely dropped. Don't let them respond to that at the end of their speech. I want to talk about briefly probability and magnitude. The probability on the government side that you're going to see China suddenly drop anything, become a doormat, is actually very low because of the fact that we've seen empirically China has instigated the US by taking advantage of and exploiting our system. We think on probability we outweigh because the probability on their side of the house of China disagreeing is very high. We also win on magnitude because we think that the impacts stretch far enough in terms of geopolitical standing, in terms of the economy and innovation. At the end of the day, don't let them come up here and bring new arguments about geopolitical standing or how removing tariffs somehow is going to solve all these issues. We are proud to oppose and urge you to do the same.
All right. Order is an overview, our case, their case, Wayne.
One more time.
So overview, our case, their case, and then Wayne at the bottom. All right. Everyone good? My time ends now. Overview of the round. If we prove that the status quo is bad, you vote AF on a triad. We have proved consistently that China is taking the first step of diplomacy, but the US has declined this in the past. Passing the affirmative plan is the olive branch, which means it's the best way to get China back on the table. Quickly before on our case, on this point and speed, we're sorry if the flowing was hard, but y'all didn't say clear or slow, so we couldn't assume that you guys weren't fine with speed. So next time in future rounds, you guys should call clear or slow if you can't understand what your opponents are saying. Go to our case, start on A1, group all of their responses. They say that the trade war is over and all of our cards from the past, but they concede a key warrant from case. Extend the diplomat 20 card under our first subpoint on advantage 1. The card is super explicit. It states that the Biden administration has not made changes to the tariff structure and thus is still examining the phase 1 trade deal. And that means that the trade war is still active. B is that this means that the trade war is still activating in this quote. They keep saying that China had tariffs in the past, but they concede that there have been China tariffs that are reactive. Look to the soybean and the chicken tariffs soybean and chicken tariffs, which literally happened as a result on US tariffs on steel, which proves that a lot of the tariffs that we've been having are reactive. Then go to their Peterson card. They specifically say that China had 2 times the more sanctions during the trade war, but this supercharges our impact because it means that whenever we place tariffs on China, China responds 2 times harder, hitting us back even stronger because that means that
and they say that that card is from 2018. Right?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
That's when the trade war was placed.
I got it. They say the card is from 2018, but that's literally when the trade war was. And also, if China's putting 2 times as many sanctions, that means us putting tariffs on them always means we're going to get hit harder. Finally, on this argument of the trade deficit, they say that we claim the trade deficit was caused by the trade war. That's not true. We say that the trade war is essentially the reason why tariffs are bad for us because we're reliant on Chinese imports. This means that anytime we put tariffs on Chinese imports, it hits us harder because the China is not as reliant on US exports. That's why structural reform hasn't happened because China can just outsource to other countries and lower tariffs on its other trading partners, which means that our tariffs have literally done nothing in order of structural change. Go to our link. Our argument is super simple. Our internal link of perception is super clean. They concede the Wang card in every single speech. They make our card seem like we just said a Chinese minister wanted to negotiate with China. That's not, or sorry, a Chinese minister wanted to negotiate with the US. That's literally not what the card is. If you look to the card that I read in the first speech, it says that Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, asked President Joe Biden to restart talks with China to remove tariffs and sanctions. But the key point in this card is where it says that Wang pointed out that the United States has greatly diminished bilateral talks at all levels because of the tariffs. That's the key part of the card they missed that says that bilateral talks have decreased as a result of tariffs. That's why our internal link still functions, because it means that China is willing to come to the table. But the fact that the US has tariffs is stopping bilateral talks and has eliminated bilateral talks from happening in the status quo, which means we still get access to all of our offense. The second internal link that they concede is that of the economy. This is super clean because they can't even give you terminalization on their case saying how many new jobs have been created. We give you a bunch of cards which tell you that 300,000 jobs have been lost. The econ story is super clear. It shows that the economy is doing bad because of the tariffs. And thus, if we remove the tariffs intuitively, it means that all of these companies that rely on Chinese goods can first reduce. They don't have to pay extra costs because domestic production always costs more, which they concede. And this is a key warranting that gets conceded out of our case, that the reason why tariffs are so harmful to US companies is simply because of the fact that domestic production means that they have lower profit margins, which leads to job loss. Go to our impact. The impact is $1.7 trillion lost in the US company stocks. This is proven by our empiric from 2020. This proves that the status quo is bad. You vote AF on the try or die. Go to their case first. There's two arguments that take out the entire net case. First is that domestic companies didn't start innovating. They just outsourced because it's cheaper. They can see this defense on their case, which proves that they don't get access to their link insofar as innovation hasn't increased. Second is, again, they don't give you a terminalization. How many new jobs are created? Insofar as they don't give you any evidence that says new jobs are created, you don't even know if any jobs are actually created. Next is that, like, again, they concede the terminal defense, which you put on their case, that says that U.S. companies still outsource, which is that they get goods from other places. It's not like they domestic produce, but they also get good from other places. This takes out the morality argument because they concede the warranting that says that companies like Nike always like outsource to other like countries. So they still use sweatshops because it's just empirically better for them as a business model because it costs less money, which is the morality argument is non-unique. Finally, they concede the REMs term. This goes completely dropped. This proves that the U.S. is losing REMs from China because of tariffs, and these are key to climate change on innovation. Absent tariffs, REMs will flow through and create good climate change products. This outweighs on innovation because we tell you that climate change is an extinction level impact. This REM turn outweighs their entire case. You can sign your ballot right here when this turns cold conceded strength of links 100%. Go to the weighing. First, on magnitude, we outweigh innovation versus $1.7 trillion lost in stocks and 300,000 jobs lost. It's clear, it's very obvious. They don't give you any quantification, so you automatically assume that our warranting is true, which means our magnitude outweighs. If they can't give you how many jobs, you assume that 300,000 jobs are greater than what other number. Finally, it also outweighs on time frame because we need the tariffs to go away right now. Otherwise, there's a double dip recession. It's uniquely key because we say if small business collapse, there's going to be a double dip recession. And innovation, this innovation argument, there's no time frame on how long it's going to take for innovation to catch up. So I strongly urge an AF ballot.
Good round, yo.
Yeah, good round.
All right, so it seems like both ballots are in. So I can go first. So this is a 2-0 for the AF. I can go first with my decision. I think that this is a good round. I just think that the AF is controlling the internal. The AF is controlling the link level for most of the debate, and what I mean by that is that the story of how the negative reaches the impacts is controlled by the AF, right? The AF is making really like compelling arguments about why small businesses are not reliant on like steel or whatever, like those kinds of argumentation is not get responded to. And so I think that because there's a very limited scope of link for the negatives arguments to your impacts, it makes it really easy for the AF to make like kind of half-hearted or mediocre responses to it and then get away with it. Because I don't think their responses are particularly great, but they're sufficient and don't get responded to, right? And so I think you need to take the opportunity to make sure that you're getting those arguments. The second thing is, I understand that like maybe you didn't hear what the AF was saying because they were going too fast. You 100% need to be aggressive in making sure that you understand what your opponents are saying. Like clear and slow them until you can hear what they're saying. That is not rude. It is simply an equity issue. If you can't hear what your opponents are saying, you're not engaging in the debate, and it's unfair to you. So make sure that you can engage in the debate. So that's really important in all your future rounds. Like make sure your opponents know like what speed of speaking you can and cannot handle for your own sake, right? Other than that, I think that the AF, there are just a couple places on the flow where the AF is extending things through, like certain warrants that are like specifically key for them to be able to get access to their internal link level, and then they end up extending things out of the 1A out into like the rebuttal speech, and the impact level for the first advantage is basically able to get me there. For the AF, I think my main issue is like very heavy on the uniqueness level and not heavy on the analytics lower down, which is an issue. The second issue that I have is that the MG is not organized. I don't know like if this is like the first round of the day, so it's a little bit disorganized, and that's okay. But for future rounds, the MG needs to signpost way better so I know exactly what's going on. And the MG needs to be very clear about what argument you're extending, where you are on the flow, because I end up just writing things down in like a list, and that is not good for you. And so for future rounds, I would say organization is an issue for the MG, but pretty easy fix.
I voted very similarly. I think that app's framing of try or die, which comes in the 2AC and is the 1AR. My speech names are definitely off, so sorry about that. I think gives them the ability to kind of like, you know, give not great responses and kind of get away with it, because insofar as they're making the claim that this is an ongoing trade war, then some sort of vague notion of innovation that really hasn't started to form yet becomes a lot less compelling. And I think that, they're able to kind of win that, a risk of their perception link going through means that it's enough for me to vote AF. I definitely agree that I think that there's too much time being spent on the uniqueness. And I think that I would have much rather seen that time, for the AF, spent on the neg case. I think that in particular, you should go harder, number one, on the REM's turn. I don't think you need to sit 3 minutes on climate change, but I think that there needs to be arguments made onto the types of innovation. Insofar as the only example that neg really gives is innovation in US steel manufacturers, which is a pretty mature industry. I think you need to go harder on that and explain why your potential types of innovation, for example, climate change and technology, which relies on semiconductors and REMs, which are being tariffed, is a lot better for the United States. And so I think that some more strategy on that I would have preferred to see that. For neg, in terms of some specifics, number one, I think that the perception link is a little bit mishandled. I think that, the argument that this is just one person, and so they don't represent the entirety of China is fine, but I think that there are better arguments to be made insofar as they're giving you pretty specific evidence, citing tariffs. I think that you can probably make some alt cause arguments, kind of giving other things that are in the way of bilateral negotiations other than tariffs. And I think then you can probably raise your defense against this to where, now there's a chance that, the risk of the AF reducing innovation goes down. In particular, though, on the negative contention level, I think that there's a little bit of issue in terms of strategy here. I think that there's some arguments made that don't get thoroughly impacted out to where you're spending significant time on them, but it's not really enough to factor into my decision. So you're sort of in no man's land there. In particular, I think there's IP theft, which is mentioned kind of a few times, but doesn't really get impacted out into innovation. And as well as I think that there's quite a lot in terms of the deficit argument where you sort of impact it out to this US being tied to the Chinese government. But once again, I think AF sort of concedes that. And, they explicitly say we're a lot more tied to them than they are to us, which is why we need to reduce tariffs so we can actually get goods we need. I think that for arguments like that, either one, spend more time on them so that you can actually gain thorough offense. And I know what that impact of the US being tied to China is, or two, don't spend time on them and spend time elsewhere, let's say on innovation, giving me specific areas as to where innovation is going to occur instead of, one example of a mature industry that isn't super compelling.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, those RFPs made a lot of sense and were super helpful. I just had a quick question. So what kind of higher quality responses would you have found more compelling on the net case?
For me, I think I mentioned it in my RFD. In particular, I think in the end of the 1AR, I think I have it flowed like quote, at the end of the day, you're weighing innovation versus $1.7 trillion and more jobs. I think like you don't even need to grant them innovation. Like at that point, you're kind of putting yourself in a risky position. I think less time on uniqueness and more time as to why their innovation is worse than like innovation that you mentioned earlier, right? In terms of climate change and other like up and coming fields.
I would very much agree with that. I think you're missing an opportunity to make more nuanced analysis. Like this REM argument is like very nuanced argumentation, but you kind of just blip it out and then hope that the 1AR can go for it later on. Like I understand that strategy, but it's just not a good one because the 1AR might not even get to it. If you're going to go to the effort to even make the beginning of that argument, right, to give yourself the opportunity to go for climate change outweighs, which is what I assume that that's like a preempt for, you should just read 3 warrants there, right? Like there's no reason to just blip the tag and then move on. I think the other thing is like organization for me, right? Like I think the quality of the responses depends a lot on how well I'm able to like flow how nuanced your analysis is. And like I think you do good work, right? Like the pipelines are not established argument for small businesses is a great argument. That's very nuanced analysis. I want to see that on every one of the arguments, right? Like geopolitics argument doesn't have really good nuanced analysis like that on it. I think you're not making that response on like the influence on America argument, which I don't think is like the strongest claim in the world, but still respond to it even if it's there. You're not really responding to the IP theft argument as much, or like the morality argument. Like there's just a lot of opportunities. And I think that the organization problem is impeding your ability to move on to all of the arguments that you need to get to, because like it's hard for you to know how much time you're spending on one thing if everything is kind of just one big block.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you. That definitely makes a lot of sense.
Any other questions? All right, in that case, good round, everybody. Go get some rest before your next round, and good luck for the rest of the tournament.
Thank you. Good round, y'all.
Great round.
Thank you.
Good
Good
luck.
luck, guys.